Although I already mentioned that I personally find this to be easily the standout car from 1.57, I did notice a few comments from you guys mentioning that you thought the suspension was a bit weird or that it would become a bit unruly, maybe kind of bottoming out even on the standard springs, and of course I mentioned having that similar issue with the Renault Kangoo, and that's an issue which we've seen before. The first time I really noticed it was the 911 GT3 with the active rear wing. That one just responds really badly to any kind of suspension modification if you really lower it. This one, for me, I don't have anywhere near as much of an issue with in comparison to what some people seem to be. Now of course here I'm using it in its fully built form, going up against Group 3 cars, and as you can see, of course it's against AI, but even so, the pace that this thing has is just monstrous. And in terms of what it's like straight out of the box versus fully built, well, it's got a great range. If you want to see more of it driving stock, if you will, then of course check out that review for 1.57 wherein I talked about it there, but for this one I am using it fully built, racing hards, full aero, fully modified, about 1100 or so kilos, well over 800 horsepower, and just under 800 points. Now obviously in terms of the fuel map, that's where you're going to notice a significant difference, such as here on an endurance event against AI, but even then, the fuel doesn't seem quite as bad, to be honest, as it easily could have been. I don't know if they've made a few smaller adjustments there, I believe they have in the past, so it could well have affected this car positively, because for a road car with 800 horsepower, typically you run out of fuel really quick. Here driving at Spa, which is of course a decent length of a lap at high speeds with an 800 horsepower road car, it still lasted more than a couple of laps, even on the full power map, rather than conserving fuel, and I wasn't even driving in manual with short shifting, so this actually does have pretty good potential when it comes to the fuel lasting a bit longer than you'd think, but it's still not necessarily going to be able to rival a race engine vehicle. In terms of how it performs, well, like I said, some people seem to have had issues. I can see what you're talking about to some degree. Under very heavy braking, if you maybe brake a little bit too late into a corner, it kind of wants to go outward with that understeer, and it does feel more so like suspension height related understeer, kind of like the Renault, but nowhere near as bad as the Kangoo in my opinion. And certainly you can definitely adjust that if you make the dampers and or springs significantly stiffer, even if you do go low. This one, for example, I think I've got it only about 5mm higher than the lowest, so that's pretty close to being slammed, and it still is taking corners like an absolute monster. So clearly this is way better than the Kangoo in that regard. That one you have to give it a good 20mm or so higher than standard to even give it a fighting chance, and even then, with that front wheel drive non-performance chassis, you can feel that it doesn't really like having a huge amount of power. With the Vantage on the other hand, it absolutely laps it up. It loves having huge power. It's already got significantly more horses than a standard V8 Vantage from before it. Those are around, what, 420 horsepower, this one's 503, so in other words more the kind of power you'd have gotten from a 5-litre Jag XKR a few years prior. 1530 kilos isn't too bad either, certainly in this day and age where the Vantage is not an overly small car, to be honest. It's a decent sized, more muscular kind of chunk of a vehicle, and with decent torque as well, of course with the radical change of approach with this era of Aston and their newer engines. It's a total change of pace for the brand. It feels wildly different, and let's be honest, Aston Martin really does not have a good showing in Gran Turismo at the moment. For race cars, they're fine, they're decent. The DB9 is probably a standout for many people, but for road cars, it is sorely lacking. It really is all on the shoulders of the Valkyrie. And the Valkyrie is fantastic, don't get me wrong, but that's pretty much it. Everything else is just not really needed at all. And it's not like Aston Martin was ever really a dominating force in Gran Turismo's history, but I think it kind of is a shame that we don't have more to work with, because much like brands like Bentley, if you were to select the right vehicles, they would have a pretty strong lineup. If you think about it, for example, if you added my favourite Aston, the Rapide, that would be a fantastic four-door. The larger length and size would give it a point advantage in terms of how much power you can get from it. Even something which seems ridiculous like a Signet, that would still be a really useful car, because for Aston fans you could use it in lower point events. Something like a classic Lagonda or other classic Astons in general, they would be fairly useful cars, but a lot of them feel like just pretty faces, kind of like the Maserati Gran Turismo. I love it, but it doesn't feel like it's really necessary for most players. That's kind of how Astons are in real life. They're not really going in for being the quickest usually, they are more about the fun factor, which is great, but it doesn't lend itself toward a racing game. Where this era of Aston definitely feels different is it's more about the performance, which I think some Aston fans, some more traditional fans that is, potentially including myself, we're not as much of a fan of that. It's lost a bit of the elegance, it's lost some of the purity, it's gained performance, but I would argue that not that many people are buying an Aston for performance first and foremost. That being said, this thing is a beast, and it is nice to have a change of pace for the Aston Martin brand in the game. It feels like a genuine threat. In fact, aside from the Valkyrie, I would say it's probably probably the second most OP Aston in the game, which as I said isn't really saying much, but it kind of is at the same time because it is a very, very rapid car. It's 210 grand to buy, so not really that bad by exotic standards, and of course 200 grand you can fart that out in 5 minutes in Gran Turismo. So across the board, as I said, I personally find it to be by far the standout car this time around. If you did come back to the game, I would love to hear if you thought it was worth it to drive this one and tune it and use it in the game. If you are thinking of coming back, maybe would this car bring you around to doing that, or are you just going to wait out another month, see what's next month, and then maybe download a few together and consider it to be kind of like one big old DLC. Whatever the case is for you, that's it for my thoughts on the 2018 shape Aston Martin Vantage. Ultimately a nice addition, even if it's not one of my personal favourites. It's more a useful car than a beloved one for me. Of course, tomorrow we'll be talking about the Kangoo, then the Mazda after that, and of course stick around beyond that for more Gran Turismo content in general. But for now, thanks for watching.